As I've mentioned time and time again, I fancy quite a bit of British culture. Now, I've already delved into the United Kingdom squared circle in 2 previous videos, but even with 2, that is nowhere near enough, which is exactly why, yet again, it's the topic of this episode. Because today, Dave knows British pro wrestling. Over the past 2 episodes, I started at British pro wrestling's very beginnings during the Victorian era, and then followed that up with the British invasion of wrestling that happened in the mid-20th century. But now it's time to head towards a different era, a dark time for British pro wrestling that came about as the world of professional wrestling as a whole was beginning to change. Because in the 1980s, the WWF would begin an unprecedented run of dominance that wrestling had never known before. But what was good for the WWF was not necessarily good for everyone else. And with Hulkamania and WrestleMania taking over the mainstream, every other wrestling promotion would begin to feel the strain. But let's back up and recap the British wrestling scene up until this point. As I stated last time, wrestler Shirley Crabtree, better known as Big Daddy, was a megastar in England's joint promotions. He was so popular with kids and working class adults alike that he even received his own comic strip and cartoon. However, by the late 1970s, his time was coming to a close, and his brother Max Crabtree, who was head booker for joint promotions, started finding ways to delay the inevitable. Big Daddy began defeating younger stars in quick squash matches in order to hide his age catching up to him, and he would also start tag teaming with up-and-coming British wrestlers who would wrestle most of the match and then tag in Big Daddy for the big finish. And with Big Daddy's stardom, this made for good television, but the predictable nature of his matches wasn't doing anything to help things going forward. And so, the company was at a bit of a crossroads. Joint Promotions, which was a private subsidiary of a public company, was doing well as a business. At least at the moment. They even managed to have their TV deal extended to carry them into the 1980s. But live audiences and backstage talent were growing frustrated and were soon about to walk away. And this was just another classic example of corporate masters being happy, signing deals, and being successful in the short term, with the fans, the locker room, and the future not being secure. It's a classic case of succeeding as a company while still failing as a wrestling company. And thus, Joint Promotions' days at the top were definitely numbered. Enter All-Star Wrestling. The company Wrestling Promotions of Birkenhead was rebranded by its top guy, Brian Dixon, as the new All-Star Wrestling. And during this time, many of the younger and technically sound talent of Joint Promotions were ready to seek opportunities elsewhere. Wrestlers began leaving for companies like New Japan and Stampede Wrestling. But then, All-Star came along to give these British wrestlers a domestic alternative to Joint. And what an alternative they were, because All-Star Wrestling was able to sign Joint Promotions' reigning world champion, John Quinn, while he was still champion. And this is where things began to shake up. In 1985, World of Sport, a program that featured a variety of different sports and was home to Joint Promotions, was taken off the air. However, there was still a heavy demand for wrestling in the UK, so instead, Joint Promotions would receive its own show, but only every 3rd week. The time slot would be set on a rotating timeshare with 2 other wrestling companies, Joint Promotions' rival All-Star Wrestling and the World Wrestling Federation. It has been cited by many that when British wrestling fans were exposed to the WWF, it marked the end of an era for much of British-style pro wrestling. The big over-the-top production value of the WWF was a stark contrast to the old, never-changing ways of Joint Promotions, which fans, quite frankly, had just grown tired of in the first place, since Joint's aging roster had become either played out or a pale reflection of what it once was. And after seeing sold-out Madison Square Garden super shows featuring real-life superheroes like Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man, many Britons just stopped supporting their local product. But now, All-Star Wrestling, on the other hand, decided to try to fight fire with fire. Sensing how the public had grown exhausted with the old traditional style, All-Star decided to adapt a more American approach to things. However, this was to no avail, as it just felt forced and couldn't capture the same attention that the WWF was getting. And in a desperate attempt to catch up to the WWF, All-Star decided to put on a disco ladder match between Kendo Nagasaki and Iron Fist Clive Myers. Disco music would play as lights circled the ring, and both competitors tried to climb a gold-plated ladder in order to retrieve a gold record. Now remember, this is the 80s. The late 80s, and disco was long over. Not that the match would be any better if it happened a decade earlier. And with this epic fail, British wrestling suffered another major hit that would turn off many fans. And to make matters even worse, Joint Promotions wasn't doing any better. Big Daddy was still managing to hang on despite the crowd's disinterest. But the biggest tragedy came in a match between Big Daddy and Mal King Kong Kurt. Big Daddy went for his big splash only to see that Kurt didn't sell the move and wasn't moving at all. Kirk was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead on arrival. It was revealed that he suffered from a heart condition and that Crabtree was not responsible, but still, all the same, was devastated nevertheless. These events, on top of an interview printed in The Sun that exposed the business and claimed that Big Daddy's kid-friendly persona was just an act, as well as many fans wanting the WWF instead, all worked to really damage the British product. And so, in 1988, it all came to a close when Greg Dyke, the new ITV head of sport, gave the axe to pro wrestling altogether. This was done in order to modernize the station, removing what was viewed as working class sports such as darts, snooker, and of course, wrestling. And with the WWF moving to Sky Television and satellite dishes becoming popular in the UK, fans were now able to get their WWF fix through other means. Joint Promotions was rebranded as Ring Wrestling Stars in 1991 and officially closed its doors just a few years later in 1995. But let's end with a few high notes, because despite all these setbacks, there would still be great things to come out of the UK in terms of wrestling during this time. Now, while Joint Promotions was no more, All-Star Wrestling was still alive, and it still is even today. And while they may not have done as well on TV as the WWF, they still did all right for themselves, touring all over the United Kingdom. And also, other companies would begin to spring up as Joint Promotions began to dwindle, such as World Association of Wrestling, the WAW, which was founded along with Jimmy Ocean by Ricky Knight and his wife, Sweet Saraya, the parents of Saraya Bevis, better known to WWE fans as Paige. In addition, Mark Sloan would create the Fratton Wrestling Alliance, which later became the Frontier Wrestling Alliance. And speaking of alliances, the NWA would also create their very first official United Kingdom territory with the NWA UK Hammerlock Promotion. And with Hammerlock, many schools would open up that became a very integral part of the training for the next generation, which consisted of stars such as Zack Sabre Jr., Becky Lynch, and Finn Balor. And of course, other schools around the UK would begin to pop up in order to quench the insatiable British passion for professional wrestling. Oh, and not to mention, World of Sport would also make a comeback too. But in closing, I have yet just one more name to bring up because I just have to mention him. The British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Now, he began his career at only 15 years old under the name Young David alongside his cousin Tom Billington, the Dynamite Kid. From there, Bruce Hart of the famous Hart family spotted the pair and invited them to compete in Stampede Wrestling. While there, Smith would continue his training in the famous Hart family dungeon. Then, after a feud with his cousin and winning his first title, Smith would then debut for New Japan Pro Wrestling. And after his feud with his cousin ended, the two would form a tag team that traveled to both Stampede and New Japan. A tag team called the British Bulldogs. The two would then quickly jump to All Japan Pro Wrestling, just in time for AJPW's annual tag team tournament, where they put on a great showing that would catch the attention of the World Wrestling Federation, where the Bulldogs would make a name for themselves in America. Davey Boy Smith would go around from the WWF back to Stampede and to All Japan, and then back to the WWF again, continuing his gimmick, but as a solo act, officially becoming the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Following a brief stint in WCW, Smith came back to the UK and joined All-Star Wrestling. And with Big Daddy leaving big shoes to fill as he was now officially retired, the British Bulldog was brought in to be the new biggest star in British wrestling history. And after winning the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam in Wembley Stadium, many will say he did just that. Which is why, to this day, the British Bulldog is the name that many fans all around the world still think of when it comes to thinking about British professional wrestling. Okay, so that was a lot of ground to cover, and of course, that's just a small sample of what wrestling in the UK has to offer. But what are some of your favorite aspects of British-style pro wrestling? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and also check out my comic book channel, Dave Knows Comics. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.